这些学习方法和技巧呢，大多数是我自己亲身使用过，或者是依然正在使用着的。我等不及想听听你们试过以后的反馈，记得给我们留言哦。Now, before we get started, I just want to go over what I call the groundwork. You see, while speaking fluently is, of course, the final goal for almost every single Chinese learner, there are a few things you need to start doing first that pave the way for awesome spoken Chinese. First, you need to make sure there are no gaps in your pronunciation. Make sure you don't have any huge, obvious mistakes. Now, there's a link in the description below to a video I made, just a general guide on pronunciation. So if you aren't 100% sure that you know exactly how to pronounce, identify every single sound of Mandarin, including the tones as well, then go and check that video out at some point. Now, the next part of the foundation that you need to speak awesome Chinese is reading. So make sure that you are on the way at least to 3,000 characters. That's the minimum you need to pretty much understand anything in Chinese. The average native Chinese person knows 3,000 characters, but most educated Chinese people know between 5 and 6, or at least can recognize them. Especially if you go to another link in the description, which has a video that I made all about how to use memory palaces to master any Chinese character in under a minute. The reason why you want to learn Chinese characters, the reason why you want to read is because reading is the most comprehensible form of input. It's way easier than listening, and your listening is just going to take a lot of time to develop. And if you recognize a bunch of characters, you'll be able to start watching Chinese TV with subtitles, consuming graded readers, listening to podcasts with transcripts, and reading at the same time as listening makes what you're listening to much more comprehensible. Speaking of listening, you need to start doing that right now, okay? Make sure that you are immersing in Chinese audio that's preferably comprehensible and compelling in some way. Reading is absolutely vital, of course, as I said, but listening is very special because if you do push through and get to the point where you can comprehend really advanced Chinese and you start listening every single day to stuff you enjoy, you are going to start sounding more like a native speaker. If you purely did reading all the time with very little or no listening, then you would develop this huge vocabulary, but you wouldn't be able to produce it very fluently or sound very accurately like a native speaker. That is the magic of listening. But again, the downside of listening is it just takes a lot of time. You just have to immerse and get mass input before you can actually start comprehending and producing Mandarin Chinese like a native speaker. So as they say, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is right now. So if you aren't listening to Chinese every single day for at least 30 minutes, an hour of active listening, they need to start doing that right away. So if you don't know 3,000 characters yet, until you get there, I highly recommend that you spend a big chunk of your study time on learning Chinese characters and reviewing them, and then the rest of your study time on immersion. Think of it somewhere in the region of 95% these two activities and maybe 5%, possibly 10% of actual output practice, so speaking and writing. If you are at 3,000 characters, then maybe you could go somewhere in the region of 50-50, 50% immersion, 50% output practice, but probably that's even too extreme as well. You always want to be spending the majority of your time consuming comprehensible input because what you produce is 100% dependent on what you consume. If, by the way, you're confused about any of this, how to get started, how to get to 3,000 characters, how to get to comprehension in general, how to immerse in Chinese, well, we've got videos in the description. Of course, we make full courses on all this stuff at Mandarin Blueprint. So just check out the stuff below and we'll take care of you. All right, so let's actually get into these hacks, tips, techniques, wisdom on how to actually speak better Chinese. So this first tip is to let go of your ego. No one cares about you, really. They care about themselves, all right? So they're not thinking about the mistakes you made in Chinese. If you get the tone wrong in front of a bunch of people at a dinner party or something like that, and even if they do give you a weird look or a slight giggle or something at the time and it is funny, first off, just laugh it off. Don't take yourself too seriously. And also, do not ever think about this stuff, right? I know that there's some people that would never dream of that, but some people like myself, I tend to overthink a lot of mistakes that I make, and it's just silly. It puts more pressure on you for absolutely no reason. No one cares. They only care about themselves. And also remember that even native speakers have trouble communicating on a vast number of things. So for example, if you ask me to talk about 18th century Russian war weapons, I would be very not fluent in English, right? Because I don't know how to talk about that. I'd be able to say, I don't know in a very good English. Native speakers get nervous. They even get tones wrong sometimes. And they're also not able to communicate really articulately on every subject. So you shouldn't expect yourself to have to do that either. My next tip is connected to the first one, and it's basically Don't try to be smart. Don't try and say things that actually in your own language are pretty challenging or that you wouldn't even be able to say. Again, this tips for me as well. I tend to do this. I tend to try and be very ambitious with what I want to say in Chinese when actually I could just use more simple language, get the point across better. And I'd cause myself less stress, less ums and ahs, and then less chance for mistakes and less chance to berate myself afterwards. In English, I'm no articulate, gifted speaker. I don't read enough, to be honest with you. And I shouldn't expect myself to do that in Chinese, and neither should you. So as soon as I started chilling out on what language I use and start trying to focus on the top 1,000 most common words, and basically just speak at a lower grade level. Speak like Donald Trump. You want to try to embody the way Donald Trump speaks. Now, whatever you think about the guy, man, does that guy communicate effectively to the people that he wants to communicate to? And because he uses language that's simple and easy to understand. And all I can say is when I started doing this, it made my life a whole lot easier. I started communicating a lot easier. People understood me. I would put less pressure on myself and everything just became so much more fun. My next tip is to try and slow your speed down by about 20 to 30%. So let's take this sentence for example. 我每天早晨会迫不及待地从床上跳起来学习中文. Now to say it at that speed, it might be easy, it might be hard. It depends on how familiar you are with the particular language in play. But it doesn't matter if it's easy or hard, just try and make all of your speech just blanket 20% slower, kind of like what I'm doing right now. For example, 我每天早晨迫不及待地从床上跳起来学习中文. So you see that it's slightly slower. It's not native speed necessarily, although some native speakers, just like with native English speakers, will naturally speak slower, so it's fine. That's why just slowing yourself down by 20 or even 30% and just applying that to how you speak will help you massively and you won't sound weird. And I'd like you to even do this with words and phrases that you're super familiar with. Don't suddenly, if you're saying a phrase that you've said a million times, like introducing yourself or something like that, 我来自英国, like saying a sentence like that, still say it slow because then that will give your brain time to get together the next sentence that you might not be so familiar with. This next tip is very closely connected to the last one, but it is worthy of its own separate section. So I listen to a lot of talk shows in Chinese. That's some of my favorite listening material. And these people talk really slow and they're very articulate. So it's like a really high goal for me to be able to talk like them one day. But what I've noticed that even these really smart, articulate Chinese people that speak really fast and they have tons to say, they'll often, when they're saying a sentence with rather long and complicated grammar, they'll say part of the sentence and there'll be a small gap, and they'll say another part and there'll be a small gap. And they might even do this 3 or 4 times with one sentence as they're sort of formulating their thoughts as they speak. So you can actually apply this to the way you speak as well, especially if you're going for longer sentences, which are far more challenging, right? You could say, for example, 我每天迫不及待地从床上跳起来学习中文. So there's like 3 gaps that I put in there. And that will again give you a little bit more time to not only formulate the next part of the sentence and the sentence afterwards, but also allow your mouth muscles to pronounce everything nicely and also clearly. Another amazing tip that you really want to apply right now, if you haven't already, is to use fillers. So I often think it's funny that us as learners, we actually give ourselves more disadvantages, or rather, we don't take advantage of certain things that native speakers take advantage of. So a native speaker, when they speak, just like we do in English or whatever your native language is, they use fillers. They'll say little words that fill the space while they're thinking of what to say. They give them time, and they also sound very normal. So for example, en in Chinese, is very common. It's like the equivalent to right? And we have 然后, and then we have 就是, then we have 那个, or just 这个. I often hear people say combinations of these, and you can actually combine these together to be even more effective and still sound like a native speaker and still give yourself loads of time. So for example, 就是那个 I've heard people say that, right? Within one sentence. Now that's a bit overboard, maybe just limit yourself to 2 or 3, but please pepper them in as much as you can. Give yourself at least the same chance that native speakers give themselves, right? So for example, you could say, 我每天早晨那个就是从床上跳起来，就是学习中文嘛。Another one is ma, sorry, it's a super common one that I forgot to add in. Ma is just like right at the end of a sentence, and it's all the time. And it gives you that extra couple of microseconds to put your thoughts together for the next sentence. It's super effective, guys. So make sure you use these fillers as you speak Chinese. Another thing I love is conversation connectors. So these are little phrases that are sort of fixed phrases that Chinese people use. They're a bit more advanced than fillers. They're not just single sounds that you make. They are actual fixed phrases, but man, are these useful as well. And if you go to the description below, you'll be able to download for free a list of over 400 of these conversation connectors with really high quality audio and an example sentence. So we'll have actually like a PDF there for you, as well as a bunch of Anki cards so you can practice these phrases on the go. Another tip for you is to use English words if you really can't think of the Chinese word. Now, while the average English level of Chinese people is very low, the average educated, young-ish Chinese person actually knows English very well in terms of understanding it. They just can't produce it so well. So the average high school graduate will have an English vocabulary of hundreds, if not thousands of words from all that memorizing they do. And, you know, they do listen to a lot of Western stuff. So if you really can't think of a word, just throw the English word out there with a bunch of 就是, 那个, 这个. And on top of that, if you use the conversation connectors and slow your speech down and add gaps in between certain grammatical clauses and things like that, if you do that, you're giving yourself so many advantages that the average Chinese learner just doesn't. My next big tip is more about the learning acquisition process rather than actually producing in real time. I highly recommend that instead of focusing on learning words, you learn phrases. Or if you do learn a word, you focus on using a sentence, reviewing a sentence to actually acquire that word, as opposed to memorizing like a list of words with an English definition or even a Chinese definition. Just don't do it. It's much more useful to say, watch a TV show in Chinese and use a tool like Migaku combined with Anki to mine it for phrases and sentences and then review those sentences instead of creating individual vocabulary cards. Now, I'm not saying don't use vocab cards. I mean, especially if you have a high quality sentence on the back of the card, but just in general, you get more bang for your buck if you focus on phrases and sentences. We communicate in chunks of the language. We don't just say individual words, right? So your study should reflect that. Another piece of advice I have for you is to not neglect writing. Now, speaking is absolutely vital, and that's where most of your results will come from in terms of outputability. But writing is essentially the same process in your brain, it's just slower. So writing is to speaking like what reading is to listening. You can just take as much time as you want with reading to consume and understand what's being said. And with writing, you can take as much time as you want to formulate a sentence. And you're going to minimize your mistakes massively. In fact, you should aim for 0 mistakes when you're writing. So look stuff up and things like that. And therefore, you'll have less chance of cementing bad habits. Writing is also really good if you're super nervous about speaking to people, you're very introverted, and you tend to make up a lot of excuses for not speaking because you don't really enjoy it that much, like dealing with people. Writing is very useful for you in that case. Next, shadowing or chorusing or parroting. It's called a few different things depending on how you do it, but essentially listening to Chinese and speaking along with it, preferably around the same time. Regardless, doing this activity will be huge for you. If you start doing it every single day, I personally, right now, at the time of making this video, I'm aiming for 30 minutes a day. I don't always reach that goal because shadowing is pretty intensive and I'm super busy, but I try to get it done in the mornings, and then I try to do another chunk in the evenings when I'm out walking my dogs. If you are moving around, it does help as well. And I think the reason for that is not just because you get extra oxygen to your brain, but also you're getting your brain used to doing other things, you know, like walking, looking at stuff, cleaning up dog poop, whilst you're actually consuming and producing the language. So that means that when you're not doing all this other stuff, when you're just sitting there having a conversation with someone, kind of like training with extra body weight on, and then when you take that extra body weight off, you perform extra well. So you can do this whilst you're reviewing your flashcards. If you're reviewing sentence flashcards, you hear the audio, which is preferably high quality native audio, and hopefully your flashcard software allows you to repeat the audio. You can do that a few times if you want. In our course, the Mandarin Blueprint method, at the end of every level, we will provide every single sentence, and there's actually 15,000 sentences in the course. course that are native level male and female audio. That will not only give you a huge boost to your listening, just doing that, but also if you shadow these sentences repeatedly, it will give you a huge boost to your pronunciation, your fluency, as well as your listening. Another thing that's very strongly connected to shadowing is just reading out loud. So to do shadowing effectively, just make sure that you are playing something that you're very familiar with. You have already looked up all the unknown words, so you actually understand fully what you're listening to as you shadow it, as you produce it, and really aim to speak not only immediately after the person speaks, but also make sure to exactly imitate the speaker. Aim to copy them completely, including intonation and stress on every syllable. Another great tip for you to perform better when speaking Chinese is to warm up. Now, actually, the reason why I put this tip here is because shadowing just for a minute or two is a really good way to warm up before you have a conversation. So if you're about to start a chat with a language exchange partner or an italki tutor, go ahead and shadow something for a minute or two. Now, you can also do certain exercises that opera singers and actors might do before they get on stage. I saw a really good breakdown of these exercises in this TED Talk, which you can go and check out. Another way to not only warm up your mouth and your brain, but also just generally make you a better Chinese speaker is to try and practice tongue twisters. A very good friend of ours, Scott Draper, is a professional 主持人, a host in both English and Chinese. His Chinese is obviously amazing. And one of the things that he does every single time before he goes out on stage is tongue twisters. In fact, just like an athlete would do push-ups and go to the gym and lift weights, Scott also practices these on a daily basis just to keep his muscles ready to go. Another tip very strongly connected to shadowing is to repeat, repeat, repeat. I have a 2-year-old son and I see him using this method, and it's the method that all of us used to learn 2 languages at the same time. In fact, when me and him are hanging out, I'll be in the front of the car driving and just talking to him, and he'll just, instead of answering me, he'll just repeat everything I say, sometimes 2 or 3 times. It's a natural instinct we have. That's how we learn our native language. And that's how you should really learn Chinese too. So when it comes to shadowing, for example, even if it's just an individual sentence, you will actually get much more benefit from going deep, not broad. So for example, listening to the same few sentences, paragraphs, or pieces of long form content over and over and over again, instead of listening to like a different piece of content every single time. Now, with that said, it's also good to give your brain a challenge. I think that you should just put a random piece of material on that you've never heard before to challenge your shadowing ability and not just become dependent on one piece of material, but just mix it up a little bit. Sometimes go deep, like really obsessively listen and shadow one piece of material or one sentence over and over and over again. I'm talking like 50 or even 100 times. And then to mix it up, listen to a brand new piece of content. My next tip is kind of obvious, I guess, but it's to have regular sessions with your tutors or language exchange partners. I recommend that if you have the cash, you set aside a budget and you pay for a italki tutor. It's just the best I found. I don't work for italki. I don't have an affiliate program with them. They're just the best one overall. It's just the easiest to find teachers there that are good. Now, you don't have to spend that money. You can also find someone on Tandem or HelloTalk. Those are the 2 best ones that I've found. And you can spend the extra effort to develop and maintain relationships with language exchange partners. I know several of our Mandarin Blueprint members that are getting really great results with just free language exchange partners. And by the way, if you ever feel nervous or just a bit weird talking to pretty much a stranger online, you can always just turn their video off or turn your video off, or you can just look off into a different part of the screen. I know this is not going to affect everyone, but I personally am not a big fan of it. And one thing you can also do in person, this is actually something that a martial arts instructor taught me once, which is if you're speaking to someone face to face and you're finding them intimidating in some way, you can just look at this point on their forehead. Obviously, your Chinese tutor is not going to be intimidating in that way, but if you find it uncomfortable talking to people in some way, then you can try that technique out. It really works. My next tip for you is to use speaking activities to keep your sessions fresh with your tutors. There are a few activities that I like to do with my sessions with tutors. For example, I like to go over a magazine and just a magazine article or an online article and just talk about it. You can do random question generators. Tandem actually has a built-in feature for that, which is really cool. It makes these random questions pop up and you have to talk about them. They're actually quite well constructed and do spark interesting conversations. Or you can do a random image generator, which you can find online too, as well as random question generators. So you look at a random image and you can, depending on your level, you describe it in as much detail as you can, or you can maybe tell a story around that image. Another piece of advice for you with tutors and having tutoring sessions is to make sure that after the session, you actually think about it. You review the session, you look at your notes. Hopefully, if you have a paid tutor, they will be taking notes and they can actually give you direct feedback on certain mistakes you've made, things that you couldn't quite say. That's what I tend to ask of my tutors. Just make sure that if you're making any major mistakes or you notice any major struggles or successes or things you enjoyed, anything about the lesson at all that's worth noting down, that you do note that down and then you review it. Maybe you keep a journal of some kind, either digital or analog. Another tip is to talk to yourself. Again, great for us introverts. If you don't have a teacher around, talking to yourself is useful. It works, right? And it sounds a bit odd and it's going to freak people out if they hear you. But here's a little trick for you as someone that likes to do this fairly often. Earphones are a wonderful thing. You can always pretend you're on a phone call. That's all I'm going to say. In fact, if you ever see me out somewhere, which you probably won't because I live in China, but if you do, you see me talking, I'm probably just talking to myself. This also gives you a great opportunity to do something similar that I said in the last point, which is to notice what you can't say. Notice that I'm trying to say something, I'm trying to describe my environment or just express the thoughts that are going on in my head, and I can't say this thing, and then note that down. You can actually then use DeepL, which is, in my opinion, the best translator online there is, and just type the thing that you want to be able to say in English into that translator, and it will come up with an incredibly, impressively accurate Chinese version of what you want to say. And then you can make that into a flashcard if you want. Another piece of advice for you that's very closely related to these last couple of points is to try to think in Chinese. This is the same kind of thing as talking to yourself, right? But just make sure that you try and formulate thoughts in Chinese. Now, if you actually listen a lot to Chinese every day, that will give you the ability, that will give you the fuel and the tools to be able to think in Chinese easier. Now, the great benefit to thinking in Chinese is it stops you trying to translate from your English thoughts into Chinese words. And that causes a lot of problems for people, including myself, right? Big problems, because there's a lot of things in Chinese that don't exist in English as concepts or ways of saying things in English that don't exist in Chinese. So if you don't get in the habit of thinking in Chinese, you'll often find yourself trying to say things and just being stumped. So for example, I mentioned on a podcast recently that there was someone who wanted to say, oh, what a good find. That's such a good find. I don't know, maybe they found an antique or something. But I don't know how to say that in Chinese, and that might exist in Chinese with that specific phrase, with that exact same connotation. But I'm not aware of the specific Chengdu or the specific phrase that would be able to communicate that. So do you know what? You don't say, what a good find. You say, it's lucky that I found that, or it's great, it's good that I found that, right? 我找到这个真好，真幸运. This is a great habit to develop, speaking just real Chinese in a simple fashion that will be developed if you develop this ability, this habit of thinking in Chinese every day. An amazing activity you can do either with a language exchange partner, tutor, or just on your own, recording yourself speak, is tell a story, an interesting story. And the most interesting stories, let's be honest, are the ones that involve ourselves. So tell a story that's like a short story about something that happened in your life recently or as a child that's positive and interesting, and then just tell that story over and over and over again. And another related activity to this that you could try that's really quite fun is if you hear someone else's story. So you have a piece of audio, so you get a graded podcast or graded reader of some kind, something with audio that you can listen and maybe even read along with a tutor or a language exchange partner, and then you retell that story in your own words. Another cool little thing you can do is use Siri or Alexa, and I believe a Google Translate app has this ability too, where you can speak into it and see if it accurately produces back the right translation. Once you've got to a high enough level of reading, remember working your way up to those 3,000 characters, I think you'll need at least 1,000, maybe 2,000 characters before you can do this, but make sure you switch to a monolingual dictionary so that you can get Chinese descriptions or explanations of Chinese words and phrases. This will keep you thinking in Chinese even when you are looking stuff up. Plus, as a bonus, you'll often learn new unexpected phrases, ways of using certain words. My next tip for you is to plan ahead of time. You can't always do this, of course, but if you know, for example, that you're going to get your car fixed and you'd like to practice Chinese with the Chinese person that works there, or you know you want to go to Chinatown and buy some vegetables or fruit, and you know you're going to deal with that kind of language, or you know you're going to go to a bike shop and there's a Chinese person there that you want to talk to, whatever. For example, I bought a car in China for the first time a couple of years ago, and I knew I had to go and deal with that on my own, right? And even though I'm fluent in Chinese, that doesn't mean that I know every word, right? There's going to be a ton of words associated with cars that I won't know. So I looked up a video of the car that I wanted to buy, and I listened to a review in Chinese on YouTube about it. It was about 15-20 minutes long, and I watched that video like 3 times. I learned all these different words for specific parts of the car and different aspects of a car's performance and things like that. And doing this really helped me a lot when I went to go pick up that car. And my final tip for you might be the most important one, which is to push through sucking. It's going to suck. You're going to suck for a while. And even when you think you're really good, you'll go into a new situation where you have to use vocabulary that you aren't familiar with or you don't know, and you might feel dumb again, right? And if you want to keep progressing and keep improving, you have to embrace that feeling of, I don't know this thing and I'm out of my comfort zone. But guess what? If you don't push through that feeling and you don't keep sharpening the saw, you don't follow all the other tips that I mentioned here today, especially around repeating and sticking with it, then you won't improve. On the other hand, if you keep pushing and you keep pushing through that feeling and you embrace that feeling and keep repeating and keep listening and immersing, you will get better at Chinese every single day. All right, so those are all my best tips for speaking better Chinese. I'm sure they're going to help you out massively if you apply just a few of them to your daily study routine. Now, in this video, I also spoke a lot about consuming Chinese, immersing in Chinese, getting comprehensible Chinese into your eyes and into your ears. And that's where most of your speaking results will come from. So if you'd like to learn exactly how to immerse in Chinese for the best possible results, go check out this video right now and I'll walk you through the entire process.